Welcome to this deep dive. We're going to be looking at the disappearance of Madeleine McCann. It's a case that gripped the world back in 2007 and still fascinates people and frustrates people in equal measure, I think. We're going to try to unpack everything from the beginning, the initial investigation, all the way to the latest developments, and hopefully along the way, we'll give you a clearer picture of what happened. It's a very complex story and obviously a very tragic story. So to set the scene quickly, imagine you're on a family holiday in Portugal, in the Algarve, and your 3-year-old daughter vanishes from your holiday apartment while you're having dinner with some friends, just nearby. It's every parent's worst nightmare.
Yeah, it is. And it's a case that has kind of become almost synonymous with missing child cases. I think one of the things that makes it so compelling, obviously aside from the human tragedy at the center of it, is the fact that there have been so many twists and turns, so many different theories, and just this constant media scrutiny that has followed every single development all the way through.
Yeah, absolutely. We're going to be looking at all of that today. We've got police reports, witness statements. We even got perspectives from the McCanns themselves. So the McCanns were staying at a resort called the Ocean Club. They were part of a group of friends who became known as the Tapas 7 because they were dining together the night that Madeleine disappeared. And the layout of their apartment, it was a ground floor apartment, and in particular the patio doors, which were unlocked, quickly became a focal point for the investigation. Initially, it was thought that Madeleine may have just wandered off. But as the investigation progressed, that theory started to unravel.
Yeah, and one of the first things that kind of jumps out at you when you compare the Portuguese investigation with how things might have been handled in the UK, is the approach to the crime scene. So the Portuguese police, unlike what British police would normally do, they didn't immediately secure the scene, and that meant that all sorts of people were allowed to go in and out of the apartment before it was properly sealed off. And there were also delays in setting up roadblocks and actually issuing a global missing person alert through Interpol. That took 5 days. So undoubtedly, those things had an impact on the investigation.
And then to add even more complexity to this, the McCanns decided to hire a PR team, which you can understand given the circumstances. But it almost instantly fueled suspicion. And it became a massive talking point in the media. And the media attention was really intense. I mean, the whole world's press descended on this tiny little town, Praia da Luz. It became a story that just completely dominated the news cycle.
Yeah, and the media's involvement in this case is a whole other fascinating angle to look at, because you have this situation where they came in with the intention of helping find Madeleine, but they ended up really shaping public perception of the case. And that, in turn, really heavily influenced the investigation.
Definitely. So let's talk about Robert Murat. He was the first person to be formally considered a suspect. He was a British-Portuguese property consultant who lived pretty close to the McCann's apartment. And he was seen by several different witnesses near the McCann's apartment shortly after Madeleine disappeared.
So Murat's presence near the scene, combined with some inconsistencies in the statements he gave at the beginning, made him a person of interest for the police very quickly, and he became what's known as an arguido, which is a specific term in Portuguese law, and it means that you're formally a suspect, someone that the police are looking at very closely, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you're guilty. So they searched his property really thoroughly, and they questioned him extensively. But in the end, they couldn't find any concrete evidence that actually linked him to the disappearance.
Yeah, he was eventually cleared. And later on, he actually received quite significant libel settlements from various newspapers that had published these damaging allegations against him. But the focus of the investigation soon shifted in a really unsettling direction towards the McCanns themselves.
Yeah, and this is where the case takes a really heartbreaking turn, because the Portuguese police started to highlight these inconsistencies in the McCann statements, mainly about how they were checking on the children and about whether the front door to the apartment was locked. And those inconsistencies, which were then amplified by the media, who were portraying Kate McCann as very cold and unemotional, that all created this perfect storm of suspicion around them.
And then there was a really controversial DNA evidence. So sniffer dogs had reacted to the rental car that the McCanns hired weeks after Madeleine had disappeared, and DNA analysis was done at the Forensic Science Service in Birmingham. And they said that there was a 100% match to Madeleine in that car. But that evidence was later disputed, but not before it had done significant damage to the McCanns' reputation.
So by this point, the Portuguese police, who were already very wary of all the media frenzy surrounding the case, became convinced that Madeleine had actually died in the apartment and that the McCanns were involved in some kind of cover-up, and this led to them also being named as arguidos. So you can imagine the pressure and the scrutiny they were facing. having already lost their daughter, and then to be considered suspects in her disappearance.
It's just unimaginable. And although their arguido status was eventually lifted, that cloud of suspicion hung over them for years, fueled by media speculation and these lingering doubts in public opinion. The Portuguese investigation eventually reached a standstill, but the McCanns continued their own private investigation. Through their foundation, Madeleine's Fund, they hired private investigators, and they pursued various leads. And all this further strained their relationship with the Portuguese police.
Yeah, and this parallel investigation really highlights the complexities of a case like this. You've got these conflicting interests, different approaches, and this incredibly high-stakes situation where everyone is desperate for answers, but they're not necessarily working together.
Right. One of the key parts of the McCanns' private investigation involved a detective agency called Oakley International, and they focused heavily on a witness statement from a couple who claimed to have seen a man carrying a child towards the beach on the night that Madeleine vanished.
Right, and that sighting became central to the theory that this was a planned abduction, and they even created e-fits, or facial composites, as you might call them, of the suspect, based on those descriptions. But the decision to withhold those e-fits from the public for years raised a lot of questions and fueled further controversy.
It wasn't until 2013, during a BBC Crime Watch reconstruction of events, that those e-fits were finally released. And that led to a surge in new interest in the case. And the Portuguese investigation was actually reopened. But by that point, the case had become shrouded in this web of theories, each with its own supporters and its own detractors.
Yeah, so was it a planned abduction? A burglary gone wrong? Or was there something else at play? There was just so much evidence, and even more speculation about what happened to Madeleine that night.
Absolutely. So look at some of those theories in a bit more detail. One of the most persistent theories is that Madeleine was abducted as part of a planned operation. And there were several witnesses who reported seeing suspicious individuals lurking around the McCann's apartment the days leading up to her disappearance.
Yeah, there were, including men who were supposedly collecting for charity, some of whom were acting very suspiciously, and asking for money for an orphanage that didn't actually exist.
Right. And there were also reports of a blonde-haired man seen watching the apartment and a young girl on a balcony who saw a man leaving the McCann's building in a really hurried manner.
And while all those observations could be really significant, they are very difficult to corroborate, and they don't definitively point to a planned abduction.
Okay, so another theory is that Madeleine was taken during a burglary that went wrong, and there was a surge in burglaries in that area around that time. And some people believe that Madeleine might have disturbed an intruder.
Yeah, and there were actually 2 break-ins in the McCann's building in the weeks before Madeleine disappeared, which lends some weight to this theory. But there were no signs of forced entry into the McCann's apartment itself, which obviously casts doubt on this scenario.
Yeah, that's true. And then there's also the theory that Madeleine might have wandered off on her own. Now, a lot of people think this is unlikely, but it is a possibility.
It is. But for that to have happened, she would have had to have got past several locked doors and gates. So it does make it seem like a less plausible scenario, but the police did look into every avenue, and that included using phone records to track individuals who were near the Ocean Club on the night that Madeleine disappeared.
Okay, so what did they find out from looking at those phone records?
Well, it led them to a former Ocean Club worker whose phone records placed him in the vicinity of the McCann's apartment on that night. And he was questioned, but he denied any involvement.
Okay.
And then there was also another person of interest, a deceased Ocean Club worker, who had a history of theft and drug abuse, but there wasn't enough evidence to link him to Madeleine's disappearance either. It's a case with so many different threads, each one potentially leading to a different outcome.
So much to consider. We're going to pick this up in the next part. But before we go, I do want to talk about Operation Grange. Because in 2011, Scotland Yard launched their own investigation. It started as a review of the Portuguese investigation, but it eventually became a full-blown investigation in its own right.
It did, and their approach was quite different to what the Portuguese police had done. Operation Grange took the stance that Madeleine's disappearance was a criminal act committed by a stranger, and they focused mainly on the possibilities of a planned abduction or a burglary gone wrong. They went through thousands of documents, conducted loads of interviews, and followed up on leads that had been previously overlooked. It was a huge undertaking.
Yeah, a massive operation.
Yeah.
And they even released an age-progressed image of Madeleine to try to generate some new leads. But despite all their efforts, the case remained unsolved.
Which really is a testament to just how complex this case is. You can have all these dedicated investigators, mountains of evidence, and years of work, and sometimes the answers still just remain out of reach.
That's so true. And this case has had more than its fair share of dead ends. But then in 2020, there was this dramatic development. German authorities announced that they had a new prime suspect, Christian Bruckner, a convicted sex offender, who'd been living in the Algarve region at the time of Madeleine's disappearance.
Yeah, Bruckner had a history of crimes, including child sexual abuse and drug trafficking, so that immediately raised red flags. And what made him a particularly strong suspect was that cell phone data placed him very near the McCanns' apartment on the night Madeleine vanished.
Wow. And there were also reports of a confession that he supposedly made while he was drunk, where he claimed to know what had happened to Madeleine, so why wasn't he charged?
Well, despite all that mounting evidence, he was never formally charged. In connection with her disappearance, he's currently in prison for an unrelated rape conviction, but German and Portuguese authorities have continued their investigation, hoping to build a strong enough case to finally bring charges against him in relation to Madeleine.
Okay, so I guess that's where things stand at the moment, but we'll delve into all that and more in the next part of this deep dive. See you then.
Okay, so we're back, and we were just talking about Christian Bruckner, who became the prime suspect in the Madeleine McCann case back in 2020. And it was pretty major development in the case. So before we move on, I did want to touch on the Netflix documentary, because that came out in 2019, and it's called The Disappearance of Madeleine McCann. And it was an 8-part series, and it kind of reignited interest in the case, introduced it to a whole new audience.
Yeah, it did. It was really well made, and it gave quite a comprehensive overview of the case. They really delved deep into the investigation, explored all the different theories, and they even featured interviews with some really key figures, investigators, journalists, and people who knew the McCanns. I don't think they presented any groundbreaking new evidence, but it did highlight just how much information there is, and how much speculation, and how many unanswered questions there still are surrounding this case. Yeah. And one thing that's interesting about the documentary is that the McCanns themselves chose not to participate.
Yeah, they did, and their reasoning was that they felt it could potentially hinder the ongoing investigation, which really underscores the difficult decisions that families in these situations have to make. I mean, you're dealing with this unimaginable grief. You're having to navigate the media and the public attention. And all the while, you're trying to make sure that the investigation isn't compromised. It's just an impossible situation to be in.
Yeah, it's just heartbreaking. And the documentary definitely sparked a lot of debate and speculation. It was a reminder that even though it had been so many years, Madeleine's disappearance was still an unsolved mystery. And the search for answers was far from over. So one thing that happened quite recently was that Christian Bruckner was acquitted of unrelated sexual offenses in Portugal, which has raised some questions about the future of the investigation. Into Madeleine's case.
Right, but it's important to remember that that acquittal doesn't mean that he's been cleared. In connection with Madeleine's disappearance, he's still the primary suspect for the German prosecutor, who's in charge of the McCann investigation, and the investigation is ongoing.
So the investigation is still active, and they're still actively looking for evidence?
They are. In fact, there was another search conducted in Portugal recently that focused on a reservoir about 30 miles from where Madeleine went missing.
Okay. And what prompted that search?
Well, it was prompted by cell phone data that placed Bruckner near that location. Around the time of Madeleine's disappearance, it was a huge operation. But unfortunately, they didn't find any substantial new evidence. But like I said, the investigation is still continuing.
With authorities in Germany, Portugal, and the UK all working together to try to uncover the truth. It's amazing with this case.
Yeah.
It's still so active. After all these years, it's one of the most perplexing and enduring mysteries of our time. It's been in the global spotlight for over 17 years now. And it sparked all this intense media scrutiny, countless theories, and so many unanswered questions. It's a story that touches on so many different aspects of the human experience: family, loss, hope, justice. And it shows us the power of law enforcement, but also its limitations. And it does the same for the media as well. So here we are, nearly 18 years after Madeleine disappeared. And we're still asking the same question: will we ever know what happened to her?
Well, despite all the years that have passed, and all the amazing work that's been done by the investigators and the incredible strength and determination of Madeleine's family, this case remains open, and it's a stark reminder that even with the most dedicated efforts, some mysteries may never be fully solved.
It's hard to accept that sometimes, but I guess it's the reality. In this case, it really does stay with you. It reminds us that children are vulnerable, and it shows us the power of hope, even when faced with such unimaginable loss. And it also makes you think about the role of the media in these kinds of cases.
Yeah.
What is their responsibility? How should they report on these sensitive stories, especially when you're dealing with families who are suffering?
Yeah, it's a really important question, and it's something we should all be thinking about.
Absolutely.
But going back to the McCanns, their ordeal is just a testament to how resilient people can be. And to their relentless pursuit of justice, they've faced so much pain, so much scrutiny, yet they've never given up on finding their daughter. It's incredible. And it's a reminder of the enduring power of love and hope, even in the darkest of times.
Yeah, it really is. In this case, it shines a light on just how complex missing person cases can be, especially when children are involved. It's easy to get caught up in all the details of the investigation and the different theories. But we have to remember that at the heart of it all, a child is missing.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I think this case is also a call for greater international cooperation, for more thorough investigations, and for everyone to be more sensitive towards the families of those who have vanished. We can't forget that these cases aren't just puzzles to be solved. They involve real lives and real heartache.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point to end on. So as we wrap up this deep dive into the Madeleine McCann case, it's clear that there are still so many unanswered questions. It's a case that has challenged investigators and captivated the public for almost 20 years now. But what stands out to you as the most puzzling aspect of this whole story?
It's a good question, I think, for me. It's just the sheer number of potential leads and theories that have emerged over the years. It's like trying to navigate a maze where every path you take leads to a dead end, or even more questions. You have all these conflicting witness statements, the disputed forensic evidence, the constantly changing list of suspects. It's just incredibly difficult to piece together a clear narrative of what happened.
You know what you mean? And I think it also highlights the human cost of tragedies like this. The McCanns were thrown onto the world stage, and they had to deal with not only the unimaginable pain of losing their daughter, but also the relentless scrutiny of the media and the public. They became victims, but they also became characters in this real-life drama that played out on a global scale.
Yeah, it's true. And it makes you think about how the media should cover cases like this,
Yeah.
Where do you draw the line between the public's right to know and the individual's right to privacy, especially when they're going through something so traumatic? And how do you make sure that the presumption of innocence is maintained, even when everyone's already formed an opinion?
Yeah, those are really important questions. And this case also shows us just how challenging international investigations can be. Different legal systems, different cultures, different approaches to investigations. It makes it so much more difficult to find the truth and to get justice. I think it's pretty clear that we need more cooperation and better communication between law enforcement agencies across different countries.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially when you have cases like this that span multiple countries. It's a reminder that we live in a globalized world, and crime doesn't respect borders. So we need to be ready to handle investigations that cross continents. And that requires real collaboration and a shared commitment to finding out the truth.
So as we step back from all this, what can we take away from this deep dive into the Madeleine McCann case? What should we be thinking about?
I think this case challenges us to be more critical of the information we consume, We should always question our assumptions, be careful about jumping to conclusions, and try to be aware of our own biases in a world where we're bombarded with news and opinions all the time. It's more important than ever to approach complex cases like this with a healthy dose of skepticism and a genuine desire to understand what really happened, wherever that might lead us.
That's so true. And I think we also have to remember that behind every headline, behind every theory, behind every piece of evidence, there are real people whose lives have been changed forever. And I think the McCanns, their determination to find Madeleine is just such a powerful reminder that love and hope can endure, even in the most difficult circumstances.
Yeah. It's a reminder that even though we might never have all the answers, we should never give up on the search for truth and justice. It's a story that makes us think about our own capacity for empathy and how we can support those who've been wronged.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the Madeleine McCann case. It's a story that is still unfolding, and we encourage you to keep exploring it. Look into the resources that are out there, form your own opinions, and stay informed about any new developments.
Yeah, and as you're reflecting on everything we've talked about today, I want you to think about this. Could there be a piece of the puzzle that we've all missed? A tiny little detail, hidden in plain sight? What could new technologies or investigative methods reveal in the years to come? The search for answers never ends. And maybe someday, the truth will finally come to light.
I hope so. Thanks for listening. And it really makes you wonder about the media's role in all of this, doesn't it? I mean, how do you balance the public's right to know with the family's right to privacy, especially when they're going through something so horrific?
Yeah, it's a really tough one. And I think this case also highlights the challenges of international investigations. You've got different legal systems, different cultures, different approaches to investigations.
Right.
And that can make it so much harder to find the truth and to get justice.
Absolutely. It really emphasizes the need for more cooperation and communication between law enforcement agencies in different countries.
Yeah, for sure. Especially when you've got a case like this that spans multiple countries. It reminds us that we're living in a globalized world, and crimes don't always stop at borders.
Right.
So we need to be equipped to handle these kinds of investigations. That can stretch across continents, and that requires collaboration and a real commitment to finding out the truth.
Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive, what can we take away from it? What should we be thinking about?
Well, I think it challenges us to be more discerning about the information we consume, to question our assumptions, to be wary of jumping to conclusions, and to be aware of our own biases, especially in today's world, where we're constantly bombarded with news and opinions. It's more important than ever to approach complex cases like this with a healthy dose of skepticism and a genuine desire to understand the truth, no matter how uncomfortable that might be.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And we also need to remember that behind all the headlines and all the theories and all the evidence, there are real people whose lives have been completely shattered by this tragedy. And I think the McCann's determination to find Madeleine is just such a powerful example of how love and hope can endure, even in the face of unimaginable loss.
It is. And it's a reminder that even though we may never have all the answers, we should never stop searching for the truth. And we should never give up on the fight for justice.
Well said. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the Madeleine McCann case. It's a story that continues to unfold, and we encourage you to keep exploring it and to stay informed about any new developments.
And as you're reflecting on everything we've discussed, think about this. Is there something we've missed? Could there be a piece of the puzzle that's been overlooked? What might new technologies or investigative techniques reveal in the future? The search for answers goes on, and maybe someday, the truth will come to light.
Let's hope so. Thanks for listening.